adult Sunday school leader. Almost exactly 1 year ago, my wife was getting out of the hospital and a snow squall was coming into the area. Got the largest dump of snow that we've had in years. And so just as she was getting out of the hospital, it had already started, and we went over to my mom's house, who's just a couple of blocks away, to pick up some things before we went on back to the house. And wouldn't you know, I got stuck in the snow. My mom lives on a cul-de-sac, and as I went down to make the turn around, that's where I got stuck. Now, as I'm sitting there in the car, when I'm getting out and trying to push the car, a lot of energy was expended. A lot of activity. The tires are spinning, but there's no forward motion. In fact, I had to call our church secretary, and her husband came and pulled us out. Well, if you've ever wronged someone, you might have guilt over it. Or maybe if someone has wronged you, you might carry a grudge about that incident. Both of these emotions are two sides of the same coin, and both can keep us stuck in our relationship and stuck in our spiritual growth, just like the automobile stuck on ice. It's a lot of activity, a lot of energy expended, but you're not going anywhere. So that's how we're finishing this unit on how to avoid life's pitfalls. Our last lesson is going to be out of the last chapter of Genesis chapter 50. And the title of the lesson is The Pitfall of Guilt and Grudges. The point of this lesson is we can only move forward when we embrace God's forgiveness. Well, this is a good time to recap the unit. And instead of going through it yourself, you might just say, now the first lesson was on the pitfall of betrayal. What was the Bible story about that day? And you wait for somebody to answer about Joseph being sold into slavery. The second week was on the pitfall of temptation. What was that story? Of course, that might come to mind about Potiphar's wife. And go on through each of the previous 5 lessons. So instead of them listening to you recap the previous 5 weeks, this gives them a chance to think and speak, your students, and probably more likely to recall the lessons later. Okay, just another little teaching tip. Well, the pitfall of grudges is very similar to the pitfall of bitterness that we looked at last week. And they both include the harboring of ill will about something that another person has done to us. So now where we left off last week, Joseph had revealed himself to his brothers, and they were afraid. We can understand why. Joseph reassured them that God was in control of this the whole time. Now in chapters 46 through 49, that's kind of our in-between chapters between last week's lesson and this week's lesson. The brothers go back to Canaan to get Father Jacob. Of course, what's his other name? Israel. And family and livestock and stuff. And they all came back with wagons supplied by Pharaoh. Well, this shows how much that Pharaoh respected Joseph. Well, Jacob lived his final 17 years of life in the land of Egypt. And when Jacob realized that his health was declining, he called his sons together and blessed each one of them before passing away. So Jacob died. Joseph is right there. He weeps. He kissed Jacob's face. And then he directed the Egyptian physicians to embalm his father's body. And so out of respect for Joseph, the Egyptians joined him in the mourning of his father for 70 days. And then Joseph asks Pharaoh permission to go back to Canaan and bury his father in this particular cave. Well, Pharaoh grants permission. Joseph and his brothers travel, bury the father. They return back. So that gets us to the last few verses of this chapter. So our lesson text begins in chapter 50 of Genesis, verses 15 through 18. Well, since Daddy Jacob has died, this got the brothers to worrying. Okay, they were afraid that Joseph may be holding a grudge against them for mistreating him so many years ago. And they thought he was holding back just for Father Jacob's sake. But now that he's gone, maybe they thought that the hammer is getting ready to come down on him. So they sent word to Joseph. Didn't say they went in person. It says they sent word to him that Daddy told us to tell you to forgive us. Okay. Now it's unclear. Did Jacob really say this, or is this just them trying to kiss up to their brother to avoid this imagined revenge? My thought, I could be completely wrong here, but my thought is that they made this up. I think Jacob would have told Joseph face to face, hey, don't hold this against your brothers. And by the way, Joseph, he'd already forgiven his brothers last week, or in our last week's lesson. And that it was okay. God was in control the whole time. He reassured them of this. And if they did make up this story, it appears that they were offered forgiveness, but they didn't accept it. And when we do that, we can live in this cycle of guilt where we're just spinning our tires. We're just never going anywhere in that relationship. Well, either way, they asked for forgiveness from Joseph here. And for the first time, at least for the first time that it's recorded, that they actually asked for forgiveness. And did you notice Joseph's response here? It says he wept, he cried. And why would he do that? Okay, they're just asking for forgiveness. Well, there's a few possibilities why Joseph may have wept over this request. Because the brothers were still feeling guilty, even after being forgiven. Joseph's thinking, I forgave them, and they're still begging me for forgiveness? I don't understand. Maybe it's because they sent word to me. They couldn't come and ask me in person. Or it could be, did Jacob really say this? Did he really think I was going to take revenge? That may have him worrying and crying. It could be some combination of all those things, maybe something completely different, but those are just some thoughts. Well, they must have been standing nearby, though, because in verse 18 it says, his brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. They said, we are your slaves. Did it occur in the mind of Joseph's brothers at that point in time that they were indeed bowing down to Joseph, just as he had prophesied so many years ago? Well, and then we get down to verses 19 and 20, and Joseph reassured them once again, do not be afraid. Your intention was to harm me, but God used it for good. And I like the way that Tony Evans states it in his commentary. He says, or he doesn't say that God used the evil for good, but that God overrode their evil for eternal good. Can you think of any things in your life that you can share with your class where something awful happened, something you didn't want to happen, maybe even something that you prayed wouldn't happen and it did, but because of that, something good came out of it? Any of you ever date anybody in high school and you just knew they were the one, and for some reason there was a breakup and you were devastated, but now you look back and you think, oh my goodness, I am so glad that didn't happen. Well, in 1990, Garth Brooks had a song, Unanswered Prayers, and one of the lines in there is, some of God's greatest gifts are too often unanswered. Some of God's greatest gifts are unanswered prayers. And in that song, it talks about him going to a football game and running into an old flame, and he's thinking, oh my goodness, I'm glad we didn't get married. Anyway, let's look on. Verse 21, that's our last verse in this week's text. And Joseph again reassured them, do not be afraid. I'll provide for you. I'll provide for your children. Don't worry about it. And again, it said he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. See, if we've been wronged, it's sometimes very difficult to offer forgiveness. It's just human nature. It's difficult to do. On the flip side of that, it's sometimes often hard to accept forgiveness. And that seems to be the issue with Joseph's brothers. So what can we learn from these few verses? Well, don't hold a grudge. Okay, we've seen this throughout the study of Joseph's life. He saw the hand of God in the awful events of his life. Now, granted, he may have seen that in retrospect and not right in the middle of it, but even in the midst of the false imprisonment, in the midst of his slavery, he kept his integrity. He didn't succumb to temptation. He didn't succumb to revenge, any of those things. Well, the other side of this coin is on the lesson is on guilt. If we've committed a wrong against someone, seek forgiveness. Okay, whether it's offered or not, whether that forgiveness is offered to you or not, put it behind you. You've done what you need to do. Put it behind you and move on. I know that's easier to say than do. But like Paul says, forgetting what's behind me, we press on to the prize before us. Well, the same thing applies when accepting God's forgiveness. And we know this, but we need to pound it in, that forgiveness What happens when forgiveness is given? The debt is wiped clean, right? It's not held against you anymore. Just like if you had a loan debt forgiven, you're no longer responsible for payment. But when accepting Christ's forgiveness, the Christ's forgiveness of our sins, the debt isn't just forgiven. It just isn't wiped off the books. It's been paid in full by someone else, by Christ. So when we continually want to go back and revisit and feel down about our past sins that we have gotten forgiveness for, it's almost like we're saying Christ's payment wasn't enough. I need to do something else. Now, granted, if the sin has wronged someone, it's cost them, then we should seek to pay them restitution. But God has forgiven the eternal consequences of that sin. Here's another lesson. Those who continually seek our forgiveness, as the brothers did, may not be as strong in the faith. Okay, they may be a little weaker, and they're not sure that they're forgiven. Don't be harsh. Okay, don't be saying, I've told you you're forgiven, now grow up and get out of here. Okay, don't do that. Do like Joseph did. Continue to reassure and speak kindly. So whether you hold a grudge or you won't accept forgiveness, you're stuck. Your relationship is stuck. It's like you're spinning your tires on ice. That relationship is suffering. It's not growing. So forgive, accept forgiveness, and move on. Life is too short. Now, next week we start a brand new unit, brand new quarterly. It's going to be living life connected to Christ. 6 lessons out of John 13 through 16. These are lessons that are the story takes place all in the final hours of Jesus' life before the crucifixion. So don't forget to pray for and with your class this week. Thank you guys for watching very much. I appreciate you.